In the dead of an Arctic winter, when the sun has vanished and the cold can shatter steel, a modern winter tent offers almost no comfort. Thin nylon walls, a film of frost, and a sleeping bag doing all the work. But 1,000 years ago, polar caribou hunters built a shelter that made this kind of camping look primitive. Their tent wasn't a fragile barrier against the cold. It was a thermal machine, crafted from the very animal they depended on. And in temperatures that plunged to 40 degrees, it routinely stayed warmer inside than the most advanced expedition tents of today. The Nunamiut of Alaska's Brooks Range weren't just hunters. They were specialists in survival engineering. They understood the microscopic structure of caribou fur, the airflow of a breathing shelter, and the balance of insulation and ventilation long before modern science named those principles. Their ichalik was lightweight, portable, and shockingly efficient. How did these hunters turn caribou skin into a portable home that outperformed modern gear by decades? Part 1. In the vast, frozen expanse of the Arctic, survival is a question of thermal engineering. For millennia, the difference between life and death has been measured in degrees Celsius, in the ability to capture and hold a few precious calories of warmth against a cold so profound it can shatter steel and freeze exposed skin in minutes. This is the story of a shelter born from this challenge, a technology so perfectly adapted to its environment that it outperformed modern equipment centuries before the first synthetic fabric was invented. It is the story of the polar caribou hunters and their incredible mobile homes, shelters built not of ice, but of the very animal they pursued. A dwelling that was, in many ways, warmer and more sophisticated than the most advanced winter tents of the 21st century. Our modern perspective on winter camping is shaped by high-tech materials, ripstop nylon, aircraft-grade aluminum, and synthetic insulation derived from petroleum. We think of a tent as a thin barrier against wind and snow, a place where the real work of staying warm is done by a high-loft sleeping bag rated to minus 40 degrees and a down jacket stuffed with the plumage of geese. But the ancestral Nunamiut people of Alaska's Brooks Range, nomadic hunters who followed the great caribou herds across hundreds of kilometers of tundra, had a fundamentally different philosophy. Their shelter was not just a shield, it was an active part of their thermal system. It was a home, a social space, and a masterpiece of insulation technology called the ichalik, the caribou skin tent. The human story in the Arctic is ancient, stretching back at least 5,000 years. The first to master this landscape were the Paleo-Inuit peoples, who migrated from Siberia into North America around 2500 BCE, crossing the Bering Land Bridge or traveling by skin boat along the coast. These early cultures, including the pre-Dorset culture that flourished from approximately 2500 to 800 BCE, and the later Dorset culture that dominated from 800 BCE to 1300 CE, were masters of microblade technology and were primarily coastal hunters, pursuing seal and walrus with ingenious toggling harpoons. Around 1200 CE, a new wave of people, the Thule, ancestors of the modern Inuit, swept across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland in a remarkably rapid expansion. They brought with them a more advanced toolkit, including the bow and arrow, large open skin boats called umiaks, dog sleds, and sophisticated sea mammal hunting equipment. It was the Thule and their descendants who perfected a life in lockstep with the caribou. The Nunamiut, a regional group of Inupiat whose name translates to people of the land, specialized in the inland pursuit of these herds. Their entire culture, from their seasonal calendar to their spiritual beliefs, was woven around the caribou's year-long migratory cycle. In spring, the herds moved north from the boreal forests to the coastal plain to calve. In late summer and fall, they moved back south. The Nunamiut followed, intercepting the herds at river crossings and mountain passes, harvesting enough meat to sustain them through the winter. These animals were their universe, providing not only high-energy food in the form of meat and fat, but also the raw materials for nearly every aspect of life. Sinew for thread, antlers and bones for tools, and, most critically, the hides for clothing and shelter. In a landscape largely devoid of trees, where winter temperatures could plummet to -50 degrees Celsius and hold there for weeks, and where the sun disappeared below the horizon for months at a time. This script will deconstruct the engineering genius of the caribou skin tent. We will explore the microscopic structure of caribou fur that makes it one of the best natural insulators on the planet, a material that modern science still struggles to replicate. We will detail the sophisticated construction of the willow frame and the double-layered skin covering that made the ichalik both weatherproof and breathable. And we will analyze the thermal performance that allowed a family to live comfortably through the Arctic winter, heated by little more than their own body heat and a single soapstone lamp. This is the story of how ancient hunters, armed with an intimate, multi-generational knowledge of their environment, created a shelter that, in its ability to retain heat, remains a benchmark of thermal efficiency to this day. Part 2. The secret to the ichalik's incredible warmth lies in the unique biology of its primary material, the caribou pelt. To the naked eye, it is simply a dense coat of fur, a shaggy covering that allows the animal to survive temperatures that would kill most mammals. But under a microscope, it reveals itself as a marvel of natural engineering, a material far more complex and effective than the synthetic insulations we rely on today. Its performance is not accidental. It is the product of millions of years of evolution in one of the coldest climates on Earth. The magic is in the hair itself. Unlike the solid, cylindrical hairs of most mammals, each guard hair of a caribou is hollow, containing a series of air-filled cells separated by thin walls. It is a tiny, compartmentalized tube, similar in structure to a drinking straw or a piece of bamboo. This structure is the key to its insulating power. Air is a poor conductor of heat, with a thermal conductivity of only 0.024 watts per meter, Kelvin, one of the lowest of any substance. By trapping thousands of these microscopic, sealed air pockets within its individual hairs, the caribou pelt creates an exceptionally lightweight and efficient thermal barrier. Think of it as a natural microscopic version of bubble wrap, or the closed-cell foam used in modern insulation. But the design is even more sophisticated. These hollow guard hairs, which can be up to 5 centimeters long in a winter pelt, are surrounded by a second layer, a dense, woolly undercoat of fine, crinkly hairs. This underfur traps another layer of still, The result is a dual-layer system of trapped air, air within the hairs and air between the hairs, that gives caribou fur an extraordinary R value, the standard measure of thermal resistance. Scientific studies have quantified this performance. A landmark 1955 study by Irene Moot, a physicist working for Canada's National Research Laboratories, measured the thermal insulation of various animal pelts using a controlled apparatus that simulated human body heat. She found that in still air, a winter caribou pelt had an insulation value of 5.4 kilo. The kilo is a unit used to measure the insulating power of clothing. 1 klo is the amount of insulation that allows a person at rest to maintain thermal equilibrium in a room at 21 degrees Celsius with 50% relative humidity. For comparison, a thick wool sweater has a value of about 0.3 klo. A typical modern down winter jacket has a value of around 2 to 3 klo. High-end synthetic insulations like Primaloft Gold offer about 0.92 klo per ounce of fill. The Caribou pelt at 5.4 CLO was, quite simply, in a different league. It offered nearly twice the Insulated study also revealed the pelt's remarkable performance in wind, a critical factor in the Arctic, where wind chill can make an already cold temperature feel life-threateningly frigid. While the insulation of most furs and fabrics dropped by 50% or more in a 25-mile-per-hour wind, the Caribou pelt's insulation only decreased to 58% of its still air value. The dense packing of the hairs, with up to 2,000 hairs per square centimeter, created a natural windbreaker, preventing the precious layer of trapped air from being stripped away. Later studies using infrared thermal imaging confirmed these findings, showing that traditional caribou skin clothing exhibited virtually no heat leaks at the seams or closures, a common failure point in modern multi-layered winter gear. The Nunavut builders harnessed this natural supermaterial with an ingenious double-layered design for their tents. The main interior sheathing of the Ichalik was made of several caribou hides, typically 8 to 10 for a family tent, sewn together with the fur facing inward. This created a soft, warm, and incredibly well-insulated interior wall. The occupants were literally surrounded by a blanket of the world's best natural insulation. The heat radiating from their bodies was reflected back at them by the dense fur, while the hollow hairs prevented that heat from conducting to the outside. Over this inner layer, a second outer layer of hides was placed. This outer layer was often made of dehaired, scraped skins, treated to be water-resistant, much like leather. This layer served as the weather barrier, shedding snow and blocking the wind. The air gap between the inner fur layer and the outer skin layer, typically a few centimeters wide, created yet another zone of insulation, further enhancing the tent's thermal performance. This double-wall construction is the same principle used in modern four-season tents, but the Nunavut version, using the vastly superior insulation of caribou fur, was far more effective at retaining heat. A modern tent might use a thin nylon inner wall and an outer rainfly, creating a small air gap. But the insulation value of this system is minimal. The Ichalik's double wall, with its thick fur inner layer, was in a completely different category of performance. Part 3. The engineering of the Ichalik was a masterclass in lightweight, portable, and resilient design. It was a structure that could be disassembled, packed onto a dog sled, and re-erected in a new location in just a couple of hours. A critical requirement for a people whose survival depended on following the migratory herds across hundreds of kilometers of tundra each year. The tent had to be strong enough to withstand the ferocious Arctic gales, yet light enough to be transported by a team of dogs. It had to be warm, yet breathable. It had to be built from materials that were readily available in a treeless landscape. The Nunavut solution was a triumph of design. The skeleton of the tent was a dome-shaped framework of willow poles. Willows, specifically the species Salix alexensis and Salix glauca, were among the few woody plants available in the Brooks Range, growing in dense thickets along rivers and streams. The Nunavut were experts in selecting and shaping them. They sought out straight, young, supple poles, typically 3 to 4 meters long and 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter at the base. These were then stripped of bark using a knife, smoothed, and carefully tapered using an ulu, the traditional fan-shaped knife used by Inuit women. To achieve the perfect curvature for the dome, poles were bent around stakes in the ground during the summer or tied to the frame of an existing tent in the winter until they dried in the desired shape. These poles were a valuable curated resource, a family's inheritance carried from camp to camp over many years. A good set of poles could last for decades. Erecting the tent was a well-rehearsed process, typically performed by a husband and wife team. First, they would select a site sheltered from the prevailing wind, often in the lee of a hill or near a thicket of tall willows. They would clear and level an oval-shaped area about 4.5 meters across, using snowshoes or shovels carved from driftwood or bone. Around the perimeter of this oval, they would thrust the pointed ends of about 20 willow poles into the frozen ground, spacing them evenly. Then, working in opposing pairs, they would bend the poles toward the center, lashing them together with rawhide strips to form a strong, elongated dome. The lashing was done with great care, ensuring that the poles were tightly bound and would not slip under the weight of the skins or the pressure of the wind. The resulting structure was spacious, with an interior of 3.5 to 4.5 meters in diameter and a ceiling height of 1.2 to 1.5 meters, plenty of room for a family of up to 10 people to live and work. The skin coverings were a testament to the skill of the Nunamiut women, who were master tailors. The process began long before the tent was built. After a hunt, the hides were meticulously prepared. They were scraped clean of all flesh and fat, a laborious process done with stone or bone scrapers called uluak. For the outer layer, the hair was removed, and the hide was often smoked or treated with natural oils, such as rendered seal fat, to make it water-resistant. For the inner layer, the fur was left on. The hides were then softened, often by chewing, to make them pliable for sewing. They would sew the hides into large panels using thread made from the dried sinew of the caribou's backstrap and needles carved from bone or ivory. They employed a special waterproof stitch, the same stitch used to make their summer boots, or kamik. This stitch, which involved passing the sinew thread only part way through the skin without piercing the outer surface, created a seam that was both incredibly strong and completely impervious to water. Once the pole frame was up, the large fur-in panels of the inner layer were laid over it. Then the outer weatherproof layer was added. For natural light, a translucent window, ingeniously crafted from the stretched and dried intestine of a bear or a seal, was often sewn into the sheathing near the door. The entrance was sealed with a large, heavy grizzly bear hide, hung to generously overlap the opening and block any drafts. Finally, snow was shoveled and packed around the entire base of the tent, a technique known as banking. This created a perfect airtight seal with the ground, eliminating any possibility of cold air seeping in from below. This entire process, from site selection to the final banking of snow, was a testament to efficiency and deep environmental knowledge. The structure was aerodynamic, its low, domed shape shedding the powerful Arctic winds. It was lightweight, the entire assembly of poles and skins weighing perhaps 50 to 70 kilograms, easily transportable on a sled pulled by a team of Part 4. The Ichalik was more than just a well-insulated shell. It was a complete thermal system, an engine for creating and maintaining a comfortable microclimate. Its performance dwarfed that of modern winter tents, which are primarily designed to block wind and precipitation, not to retain heat. A typical four-season mountaineering tent might create a temperature differential of 5 to 8 degrees Celsius between the inside and the outside, relying on the occupant's sleeping bag to provide the bulk of the insulation. The Ichalik, by contrast, could maintain a differential of 30 to 40 degrees Celsius or even more. With an outside temperature of -40 degrees Celsius, the interior of a caribou skin tent could be a comfortable 0 to 5 degrees Celsius, heated by nothing more than the body heat of its occupants and a single small flame. An adult human at rest generates about 100 watts of heat, roughly equivalent to a standard incandescent light bulb. A family of 5 would therefore produce about 500 watts of continuous heat, equivalent to a small electric space heater. This passive heat source was supplemented by the kulak, a crescent-shaped soapstone lamp. The lamp burned rendered seal or caribou fat with a wick of Arctic cotton or dried moss. It was the heart of the home, providing not just light, but also a steady, low-intensity source of radiant heat for warmth and for melting snow for drinking water. The combined radiant heat from the lamp and the occupants was captured and held by the super-insulated walls of caribou fur, creating a pocket of warmth and life in the frozen wilderness. This remarkable performance was not just due to the insulation. It was also a result of a sophisticated understanding of airflow and moisture management. The waterproof outer layer and the snow banking at the base made the tent essentially airtight from the outside. However, a small adjustable opening was left at the very top of the dome. This vent, combined with the slightly porous nature of the hide construction, allowed the slow escape of warm, moist air. This created a gentle, continuous convection loop. As the warm, moist air from breathing and cooking rose and exited, it drew fresh, dry air in through the entrance. This constant, slow air exchange was critical. It vented carbon dioxide and other fumes, preventing the air from becoming stale and dangerous, and it removed excess moisture. A sleeping person can release up to a liter of water vapor overnight through breath and perspiration. In a modern, non-breathable nylon tent, this moisture condenses on the cold inner walls, where it freezes into a Laochalic's breathable design allowed this water vapor to escape, keeping the interior dry and the insulation effective. The Nunamiut lived in these tents. They were not just for sleeping, they were homes. The interior was a social space, a place where women sewed, men repaired tools, children played, and families gathered to eat and tell stories through the long, dark months of the Arctic winter. The floor was often covered with additional caribou hides, fur side up, creating a soft, warm carpet. This level of comfort and livability is simply unattainable in a modern expedition tent, which is typically a cramped, functional space designed for short-term occupation. The historical record is clear on this. As the Nunamiut began to transition to a more settled lifestyle in the mid-20th century, culminating in the founding of Anaktuvuk Pass in 1949, they initially moved into canvas tents and later wooden frame houses. Many elders, interviewed in later years, recalled that these new, modern dwellings were often colder and draftier than the Itchalik they had grown up in. The canvas tents offered poor insulation, and the early frame houses were not built with the same attention to airtightness and thermal bridging. The ancient technology, for a time, remained superior. Part 5. The story of the Itchalik is a powerful lesson in the sophistication of indigenous technology and the importance of environmental knowledge. For thousands of years, the caribou skin tent was the key to human survival in the North American Arctic. It was a technology that allowed people to live a nomadic lifestyle in near-perfect harmony with their environment, a system that provided not just shelter, but a warm, comfortable, and sustainable home. The era of the Itchalik as a primary dwelling came to an end in the mid-20th century. The collapse of the western Arctic caribou herd, which plummeted from an estimated 300,000 animals in the 1890s to just 15,000 by 1900, forced a dramatic change in the Nunamiut way of life. Many families left the Brooks Range for the coast. Although some returned in 1938, establishing camps at Chandler Lake and the Keelik River, the establishment of the permanent village of Anaktuvuk Pass in 1949 marked the end of the fully nomadic lifestyle. The lightweight, portable skin tent was replaced by canvas and later by plywood and modern insulation. The deep generational knowledge of how to select poles, how to sew waterproof seams with sinew, and how to manage the delicate thermal balance of the tent began to fade. Yet the principles behind the Ichalik remain as relevant as ever. The concepts of superinsulation, airtightness, and controlled ventilation are the very cornerstones of modern high-performance building science, such as the Passive House Standard. The double-layered wall, the management of thermal bridging, and the focus on capturing internal heat gains are all ideas that were intuitively understood and masterfully executed by the Nunavut builders centuries ago. They created a shelter that was not just energy efficient, but was built entirely from local, renewable, and biodegradable materials. It was the ultimate expression of sustainable design. Today, as we face the challenges of climate change and resource depletion, the legacy of the polar caribou hunters offers a profound inspiration. It reminds us that the most advanced technology is not always the most complex. It is the technology that is most perfectly adapted to its context. The Ichalik demonstrates that a deep observational understanding of the natural world, a form of science in its own right, often referred to as indigenous knowledge systems or traditional ecological knowledge, can lead to solutions that are more elegant, more efficient, and more sustainable than those produced by industrial science alone. The village of Anaktuvuk Pass, established in 1949 and now home to about 250 people, stands as a living link to this heritage. The residents still rely on caribou herds for most of their meat, though they also hunt Dall sheep and harvest fish and waterfowl. While they no longer live in caribou skin tents, the knowledge and values that created those tents, the deep respect for the caribou, the understanding of the land, the emphasis on community and sharing, remain central to their culture. The Simon Paniak Memorial Museum in Anaktuvuk Pass preserves and celebrates this history, displaying traditional tools, clothing, and a full-scale replica of an Ichalik, ensuring that future generations can learn from the wisdom of their ancestors. The Ichalik is a testament to human ingenuity, a blueprint for resilience written in willow and hide, and a powerful reminder that sometimes the best way forward is to look back at the lessons of the past. The warmth of the Ichalik was not just a matter of physics. It was the warmth of a home, a culture, and a way of life in perfect balance with the frozen world outside.